I'm going to begin the session.
Okay. Welcome, everyone.
This meeting is now being recorded.
Hello, this is David Lee, and welcome to today's NewApp webinar, Advocates Introduction for Gender-Based Asylum for Survivors of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We're glad to have you able to join us today. We welcome to today's session. This project is supported by a grant number 2015 TAAXK043 awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women. I do want to talk briefly about how to use the technology. This is a way that you can be able to connect with us. If you look at the above my head, on the far left-hand side, there's a little hand that says My Status. If everyone go ahead and please raise their hand by clicking on that. And that will be a great way of being able to connect. What we do during the NewApp web conferences is that we want to have your participation and your feedback. And so this is one of the ways they'll be asking many questions of you. I only see 28 of you have put that. So if you can please raise your hand, we would appreciate that. It's a way that we can get some information for all of you. Thank you for joining us today for today's NewApp web conference. We do have the text chat. I see many of you have already begun to be able to do this, and to write a message, you just on the bottom, it's now appearing on your right-hand side. Just write a message there, and you press return. There's no longer the arrow button to do that. It's a way to do this, so I want to thank you there. We do have slides for today's presentation. They will be available on the NewApp website. I believe that Rocio will soon be posting the address where you can be able to get copies of the slides later on. And then we also have the phone number, and that you can call in if you are having trouble calling in. Imelda just put in the phone number to call in. Some people are unable to get here. If you're not seeing the slides, go ahead and click the tab that's called Advocates Intro. And I'm going to ask a yes/no question, actually. Are you able to see the slides? In the lower left-hand corner, let's go ahead and let me know if you're able to see the slides. I've got a lot of people who can't see the slides. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close the slides and reopen them for everyone, and this should solve that problem. There. Now, can you see the slides? And we are now getting yeses. So we have now moved to there. I am glad we're able to solve that problem. Technology is great when it works. If you are having trouble getting onto the web conference, you can always call iLink Technical Assistance at 800-799-4510. For the audio, we are going to ask you to probably call in for audio. Is the best way to get the audio, and we will be posting the way to get there. It appears that we do not have an option of connecting through the internet. You would had to have downloaded your software in order to listen through the internet today. So with that, I am really want to be able to bring us to today's speakers, and I'm really proud to be able to have Leslie Orloff, who is the director of the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law, NewApp. So hi, Leslie.
Hi, David. Welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. And we're also joined today by Morgan Weibel, and Morgan is the Baltimore director for, and I am going to mispronounce the name of your agency, so can you say it so we get it correctly?
Ta hooray. Say hooray and put a ta at the beginning of it.
Ta hooray, Justice Center. Thank you, Morgan, for joining us. And we also are joined by many other supports. We also have Edna Yang, who's the Assistant Executive Director for American Gateways. How are you doing, Edna?
Hi, David.
Great, thanks. So glad to have you. We are also joined by Rocio Molina, and she's the Associate Director at NewApp. How are you doing, Rocio? I think she's off in the background, and you will see Rocio answering many questions. So I don't hear you yet, Rocio. We also have Ben.
Be on mute.
BB Anver. Benisha Anver will be call you Bibi, who is a policy attorney at NUAP. How are you doing, Bibi?
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you all, and it's a pleasure to have all of you for today's important topic. Today, our learning objectives are, by the end of the training, you will be better able to describe immigrant protections and benefits available through gender-based asylum survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. You'll be able to identify and support immigrant survivors that are eligible for gender-based asylum and be able to connect immigrant survivors to attorneys and resources available for survivors of gender-based violence. So with that, I do want to ask another question. I'm going to change this to ABCD on the left-hand side. Please let us know what best describes you. Are you A, an advocate, B, an attorney that works with survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault, C, an attorney working for a legal services corporation-funded agency, or D, other? And I'm going to share these results. And Leslie, it's really great to see half of our audience are advocates. And
great, wonderful.
Another 15% are attorneys who work with survivors, and another 12% are attorneys who work at an LCS-funded agency. And
those of you that say other, if you could type in the chat box where you're from or what type of program you work with, that would be incredibly helpful.
Great. I see we have paralegals, juvenile justice, a law student from state coalition, from judicial branch, mental health counselor, another paralegal, battering intervention and prevention program, another paralegal. So we see a wide range, program specialists with the Office of Judicial Planning of the Virginia Supreme Court.
Officials, Sheriff's Department, fantastic.
Great.
Great. So as we start, this is Leslie. I want to kind of talk about, I'm really excited to see how much diversity we have in attendance today. And because this is an important issue, as we go, as in recent years, we've seen a big increase in the number of immigrant victims of domestic violence and sexual assault who are ending up in programs in our communities needing help with domestic violence and sexual assault, and sometimes the abuse they suffered may have happened abroad. And the kind of immigration relief, the gender-based asylum we're going to be talking about today, our goal is that by the end of the training, you'll really have a better understanding of the important role victim advocates, courts, non-immigration lawyers and others can play in identifying these cases of victims who have forms of relief available to them and connecting them with or helping them with attorneys who can help them, or even we're going to be talking about how to recognize these cases and the important role that non-immigration attorneys can play in handling these cases, because a lot of the work that those of us that are family lawyers or domestic violence lawyers or advocates are doing in terms of documenting domestic violence, identifying domestic violence and sexual assault and the associated trauma with it that comes along with it, are some of the kinds of information that would be needed in the asylum case, and that the collection of the stories and understanding the victim's stories and experiences that we do already is an important part of this case. So that what we want to be sure you come away with is, A, the role that you can play in identifying these cases. If you're an attorney and there's not an immigration program in your community that either has space right now or the experience or expertise to handle these cases, part of what we want you to know is there are nationally resources and supports available to you to help you do these cases. And in fact, 2 of the technical assistance providing organizations nationally on the issue of gender-based asylum are Tahiri and American Gateways are available to help you should you decide should you find a case like this and want to do it. And there's also resources available to support you in working on these cases through the UC Hastings Center for Gender and Refugee Studies and through ASISTA, one of our national partner organizations. And for lawyers, just as up front, I wanted to say that it's important to know if you're a lawyer funded through a legal services agency, later on in this program, Bibi will be talking about how LSC-funded agencies can actually always do this work under current regulations, and that for those lawyers that after this webinar are enticed or interested or decide to take on one of these cases, you should know that there's support available both in technical assistance and more advanced training webinars for the lawyers who decide to take on these cases. What I want to do is just start very briefly. That's kind of some background of why we're here, and just to highlight the unique barriers that immigrant victims have when they come to us in our programs that we as domestic violence attorneys, legal services attorneys, and advocates, justice system people have to work through to be able to encourage victims to come forward. And that these are in the background and are key parts of all the kinds of cases that we're talking about, including the gender-based asylum cases. So it's language access. They may distrust police in their home country and be reticent to come forward and talk to law enforcement. Lack of information about their legal rights with the perpetrator controlling the amount of information she had. And there may be limited access to public benefits, particularly that are going to differ for immigrant cases as opposed to some of the other cases you might work with. And that the inability, there's also immigration-related issues like the inability to work. Gender-based asylum like VAWA and U visas can bring a path towards work authorization. The perpetrator may be controlling her documents. There may be cultural awareness work that needs to be done with other people in the justice and social service systems that work with victims. And victims, these victims of gender-based asylum, as like other victims, but many of the gender-based asylum victims will be more new arrivals. And so this isolation of culture and trying to break through those barriers and reach women so that they can know about their rights and seek help is super important. There's a range of immigration-related abuse tactics that perpetrators may use against these victims, as they would all other victims. As we see, immigration-related status, power, and control may be a factor. But that's a factor that this remedy, like the remedies of VAWA and U visa, can really help overcome. So it's important. This is an important source of relief, immigration relief, access to legal status, protection from deportation, and work authorization for immigrant survivors. Other than immigration status, just to make sure you guys all have the chat box going and you begin to interact with us on this webinar, why don't you type in what are some of the other issues when we're talking about a holistic approach to serving victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, whether the abuse happened in the U.S. or abroad. What are some of the issues that you think victims need? So we have material, financial assistance, housing is a big one, counseling, mental health assistance, medical assistance, child care, getting help with their children, divorce, interpretation and translation services. That's true. David, you want to help me with some of these?
Yeah, legal, more divorce, education, work, assistance for families, relocation.
And on the relocation front, what I think is really interesting is you'll hear from this webinar as we talk about gender-based asylum, a lot of the women that you may identify as potential people who are eligible for gender-based asylum will be people who have potentially relocated newly to your community. And so that's right. A lot of the same assistance that we're seeing, the kinds of things that battered women we work generally with, will also be the kinds of services and support that these victims need. I'm going to turn it over now to Morgan.
Good afternoon. So you all have done a fantastic...
Excuse me, Morgan, we're getting a little bit of feedback there. A speaker that has sound in the background. Great, Morgan, it's now clear.
Okay, great. So you all have done just a fantastic job of highlighting a lot of the non-legal needs that survivors may require. And as you can see from this slide, at the Tahrir Justice Center, we recognize that true justice and being able to obtain it requires much more than just legal services. So although I am an immigration attorney by trade, I often partner up with colleagues in other departments in order to meet all of the holistic needs that our clients require in order to truly access justice. All right. So before we begin and dive deeper into asylum law context, we want to just speak briefly about some of the other forms of relief that may be available to those who qualify for gender-based asylum. And the reason why we do this is just to keep in the forefront of your minds that often there may be multiple forms of immigration relief available to a survivor, and you should certainly pursue all avenues of relief and consider them quite strategically. So beyond gender-based asylum, there are also the U visas for victims of serious crimes who are cooperating with law enforcement, Violence Against Women's Act-based petitions for those members or family members of abused U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents or green card holders. There are also special visas for victims of human trafficking, both sex and labor trafficking. There are special immigrant juvenile status petitions for children who are not able to reunite with one or both parents due to abandonment, abuse, or neglect. And then finally, one thing we want to raise everyone's awareness about at Tahrir is forced marriage, and that there are many state and family law remedies out there to protect victims facing forced marriage throughout the United States. So in 2014, we had a fantastic victory for survivors of domestic violence who are seeking asylum, and that is this matter of ARCG case that happened at the Board of Immigration Appeals, which really set precedent throughout the country to justify cases of asylum being granted based on domestic violence. And so we raised this case with you so that everyone has a sense of the background of the law as we continue through this presentation. So let's look first at kind of the types of protection that are provided through gender-based asylum. And again, as Leslie pointed out, when we talk about asylum cases, we're talking about women who are fleeing abuse or fear back in their home countries.
Great. So, Morgan, let's go have people raise their hands. If you have encountered an immigrant survivor who fled from her home country and abuser and is fearful to return to her home country, so go ahead and raise your hand just by clicking that little hand above Morgan's head that says My Status, saying raise your hand, saying My Status. If you've encountered an immigrant survivor who fled from her home country and abuser and is fearful to return to her country. And Morgan, I see over 70 people, almost more than a third of our audience have had that experience.
That's
wow.
Leslie, that's really great to see. That's what we suspected was happening, that many of you would be seeing these cases, and that's why we're so happy to be able to bring you this as a resource today. Back to you, Morgan.
Great. So some of the typical ways that you may encounter survivors of gender-based violence is that they may be seeking a service that's entirely different than asylum. They may mention abuse from their home country as a primary reason for fleeing. And they may also be demonstrating themselves as a survivor of sexual assault. I will say that one of the things that we have seen increase dramatically over the past few years of women who are fleeing the Northern Triangle and other areas of Latin America is what we call complex trauma. In other words, women who have been victimized repeatedly and in different forms. One of the common patterns that we're seeing right now in a lot of the cases of gender-based asylum that we're filing is a woman is singled out or targeted by someone within the community with power. That might be a prominent politician or a gang member, maybe someone who's involved in the military or holds a position within the local police department. And they initially target this woman for a sexual assault or a rape. And if she becomes pregnant or if it becomes public information that she has had premarital sex, families will step in to arrange a forced marriage or broker some sort of similar relationship like marriage status, maybe cohabitation in a home with her rapist or the abuser. And then after that, she's subjected to many years of domestic violence and rape and other forms of sexual violence. And so what we're seeing is victims are presenting with quite a bit of trauma and repeat traumas throughout their lifespan. So what are some of the benefits if you are able to successfully help a survivor apply for and obtain asylum? The first and kind of most prominent in everyone's mind is that she gets permission to stay here in the United States and to work legally. She'll also be eligible for other public benefits like refugees, which can include cash and medical assistance. And then certain family members can also obtain the similar status and access to benefits and privileges such as work authorization. But it's important to note that asylum, unlike other forms of immigration relief out there like the U visa, works only in one way. So children can derive from their parents' status, but it doesn't go the opposite route. So in other words, if a child is granted asylum, they cannot then turn around and petition for their parents in order to get the same relief like you might see in a U visa context. So that's a somewhat limiting factor. But the good news is that everyone who applies for and is granted asylum has a year in that status before they're eligible to apply for a green card. And as you may be aware, that becomes a pathway to citizenship in the future. So let's take a look at the definition, the legal definition of asylum. And what you're seeing up on your screen here is language from the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees and then the 1967 protocol to which the U.S. signed in 1968. And so this language was incorporated into our domestic law here in the United States through the 1980 Refugee Act. But what's interesting about this language is it parallels the language that you will see and the definition that is used roughly throughout the entire world because it comes from that international treaty and convention originally. So every asylum claim has core elements, and we're going to go through each of these elements in much more detail. But just so that you get a sense of what an asylum case is made up of, there's an element of persecution or harm. There needs to be a showing of a well-founded fear of harm. There's a nexus, or something that I like to refer to as the motivation of the persecutor to target the victim. And that needs to be linked up to one of the statutory grounds, and there are 5 that we will go over. And then there has to be a failure of the state to protect this victim. So let's look first at persecution. You'll see up on the screen several different types of harm that have been found to constitute persecution. Now this varies throughout the country and from region to region, and so it's always important to consult with an immigration attorney to make sure that the form of harm that the individual that you are working with has experienced falls within that actual jurisdiction's realm. But just to give you a sense of the types of harm that have been found by the courts to rise to the level of persecution, it's things like threats to somebody's life or freedom, so death threats, rape and sexual assault, torture, physical harm and beatings as well. And then economic persecution, if it's so severe that it threatens the livelihood of someone, can also constitute persecution. And it's important to keep in mind that when the courts look at these forms of harm, they look at them in the totality of circumstances. So in other words, they look at kind of all of the harm that someone is experiencing to determine whether or not it rises to the level of persecution under the law. So David, did you want to do this poll?
Oh yeah, let's go ahead and do this. So please raise your hand if you have encountered an immigrant woman who's faced threats of death in her home country upon refusing to pay renta or extortion requests from gang members. So have you had the experience of encountering an immigrant woman who's faced death threats in her home country upon refusing to pay renta or extortion requests from gang members? And so, Morgan, I'm noticing that we have 39 of our participants have seen this.
All right, David. And the wonderful thing is that here in the Fourth Circuit, where I practice, they've recognized that type of extortionary request to constitute persecution. And so, as we see increasing cases of gangs throughout Latin America requiring renta or extorting the local population, it's great to know that courts are starting to recognize that as a form of persecution under the law. So let's take a look at this concept that we refer to as humanitarian asylum. We talked already about what constitutes persecution. And so if you have a survivor who is able to establish that they have been persecuted in the past, but that original persecutor that harmed them perhaps dies, or the conditions in the country change so that there seems like there's no longer a well-founded fear that that person would be harmed if they went back home, there's two additional ways that someone would be able to obtain asylum under humanitarian asylum.
Excuse me, Morgan, we're getting a background sound, and I don't know if that's one of our speakers. If I hear it again, we'll have to mute everyone's line. I'm going to mute everyone's line.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Hi, if speakers, can you please press *6 to unmute your phone? For all other participants, please do not, so we don't hear background sound. Morgan, are you back on the line?
I'm here, David. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Great. And there was just a question about the Fourth Circuit. Where is the Fourth Circuit for those who are not familiar with their geography and their circuits?
Sure. So it's on the East Coast, and it covers areas like Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, in that region. So that the court system splits up across the country, and you could do a quick Google search if you wanted to look and see kind of what states fall into each of the different jurisdictions of the Federal Circuit Court. So David, back to humanitarian asylum. If your client or if a survivor has experienced past persecution, but there might be a question about whether or not she has a scenario where she's returning to that same harm, if she were to go back today, there's two ways for her to still be able to claim asylum under this concept of humanitarian asylum. The first is to show that the harm that she suffered in the past was so severe and atrocious that we wouldn't ask her to go back to a place that would make her essentially relive that experience or rehash all of the harm that she had experienced in the past. And you can see on this slide the Matter of Chen case, which was a Board of Immigration Appeals case that really helped lay out the context of that severe and atrocious harm. But the other way that she can also remain in the United States safely under humanitarian asylum is to show that that there's a reasonable possibility of other serious harm upon return. And in the context of women who are coming from Latin America, that might be as simple as showing how expansive gang-based violence in the country is, how often women are targeted and attacked. And so that persecution itself does not need to be linked to any of the 5 protected grounds. It doesn't have to be part of that motivation to harm her like the past persecution situation does, but it needs to be equivalent to persecution. So it's got to be a harm that would rise to that same level of persecution in the future. Let's take a look at well-founded fear of future harm, because it is possible that you interface with a survivor who has not yet experienced any harm, but is afraid of harm in the future. And if that's the case, she's going to have to show 2 things. One, that her fear is subjective. In other words, that she's actually afraid, and we'll go into this in more detail in the next slide. And the second is you have to show that that fear is objectively reasonable. And basically what that means is that any reasonable person who found themselves in the same circumstances that she's facing would be afraid that they would be harmed if they had to go to that country. And then also the Supreme Court established that a woman need only show a 10% chance of future harm in order to qualify for asylum. And so this is really important to keep in mind, because there are certain areas of the world where the harms facing women far exceed 10%. For example, if you were able to submit a Department of State country conditions report on human rights that showed that 15% of women from a given country who are married suffer domestic violence, you would be in a position of showing that there's already a reasonable possibility of that harm and establishing that she truly has a well-founded fear of harm in the future. So let's go back to that subjective fear element and walk through some of the ways that a survivor might demonstrate that she's subjectively afraid of going home. She'll do that through a written declaration where she explains kind of all of her fears and outlines anything that may have happened in the past that leads her to be afraid. She may also provide live testimony, either at the asylum office or during a direct examination in immigration court. But then also she's able to submit letters and affidavits from friends and neighbors, family members, others who understand the fears that she's expressing and have witnessed anything that can help support that. Psychological evaluation can also be extremely helpful in establishing an individual's subjective fear. And finally, letters from therapists or other service providers and advocates out there that are working with this individual and can help express that subjective fear element.
Great. So let's pose a question to the audience, and I'm going to put up an ABC D option on the left-hand corner. In what ways can advocates support immigrant survivors applying for gender-based asylum? So A, assist survivor collection, documentation, and victimization. B, support or connect with survivors support or connect with survivors with professionals experience working with survivors of trauma. C, provide expert testimony. Or D, all of the above. So go ahead and everyone get a chance to vote. I still see another 100 of you have not voted yet. And I will share, Morgan, I'm going to share the results, and indeed our audience does say all of the above.
Fantastic. Let's move on to looking at Nexus, or the on-account.
And that's true. Morgan, we should point out that that is indeed true, that it is all of the above.
It is, yes. So moving on to the Nexus, or on-account of element, the way I like to describe this is where we as attorneys connect the dots between the persecutor's motivation to target the person and one of what we call 5 statutory grounds. So that's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. In other words, what we do when we talk about Nexus is we explain to the court or to the adjudicator why the abuser has singled out or targeted this particular survivor. And so let me give you an example of this in the sense of an abuser may target his wife because he views her as his own property. Now that they're in a relationship and married, he may feel entitled to harm her because of that status that they have in the relationship. And that would be one of the grounds that we're drawing a link to in the particular social group category, for example. But what the law recognizes is that there might be multiple motivations that make a persecutor target an individual. And so this same abuser might become particularly violent with anyone, not just his wife, but anyone, when he engages in drugs or drinks alcohol. And the fact that he becomes violent with anyone shouldn't negate the connection or that link to the particular social group qualification for asylum. And so in another way to say this is it needs to be one of the central reasons that he's targeted her, that he views her as property, and that relationship status that they have is what he is somewhat motivating her. But it does not need to be the primary or only reason that he is targeting her for that persecution. So let's take a look at some of the different forms of gender-based asylum that we see out there. And I mentioned the statutory grounds before. So political opinion is one of them, and so women may be harmed or targeted by their abusers or persecutors because of an actual or an opinion that the persecutor is placing upon them about their role in society or control over their own bodies, and that can be interpreted as the political opinion grounds for asylum. She may also be targeted because of her religious beliefs that differ from her persecutors. And it's important to point out in these situations that even if the persecutor shares the same religion, so for example, one of the prominent cases in this area is a father whose interpretation of Islam was stricter than his daughter's. And so he harmed his daughter because he believed that she wasn't interpreting the same religion that he maintained in the same way. And so it's entirely possible that there are gender-based asylum claims out there where the persecutor and the survivor share the same religious beliefs, but that can be a grounds for asylum. And then finally, the most common area that we see these cases in is membership in a particular social group. So that's women who have a similar characteristic. So that might be something like an age or a tribal affiliation or a family membership or a shared experience like being in a domestic relationship or undergoing FGM. And because of that characteristic, their persecutor is targeting them or singling them out for harm. Then the final element in asylum cases that we see is a failure of state protection. So unlike some of the other forms of asylum, gender-based asylum often means that the persecutor is a non-state actor. So in other words, is not a government official. And in those instances, the individual survivor needs to prove additionally that her country's government cannot offer her any effective protection from that non-state actor. So in other words, she's got to show that either the government's not willing, so for example, she's reported the domestic violence incidents to the police several times and they refuse to go out and investigate or to arrest her spouse or the perpetrator of abuse, or she needs to show that the government is absolutely unable to protect the individual. And in cases where we're seeing...
I'm sorry, we were getting a sound, and I don't know if that was one of our speakers. Okay, I'm just trying to get someone to mute their phone. Thank you. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure, no problem. In cases where we're talking about gang-controlled territories, and the persecutor is a gang member, it may be that the government has every desire to actually control the gang, but they just are unable to do so. They don't have the resources, or there's not the political willpower in some areas of the government to be able to overtake the gangs and really offer viable protection to the survivor. And so in those instances, an individual would be showing that the government is unable. It's an either or, so it doesn't mean that she has to show both, but she must show that either the government's unwilling or unable to protect her. And finally, just to keep in mind that that does not mean that every survivor who applies for gender-based asylum must report the abuse. There's some great case law out there that recognizes that in many instances it would be absolutely futile for a woman to report abuse to a police force that doesn't see it as their role in intervening in those matters. And so, we all as advocates that work with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors recognize that often it may put an individual at heightened risk to report an abuser, and so the case law recognizes that, and it's not a requirement, but there must be some other evidence to explain how it is that the government will not protect this individual. All right, let's take a look at some of the bars that there are to asylum, because after you have identified a survivor that looks eligible in all of these other ways we've discussed today, you'll want to make sure that there aren't any bars that would prohibit her from being able to obtain this relief. So the first and most frustrating bar out there is that under U.S. law, every asylum applicant has exactly 1 year from the date of their last entry to apply for asylum. And if they don't apply for asylum within that year, they have to show that they meet one of several exceptions. Unfortunately, there's no exception that says the applicant simply wasn't aware that the law existed, that she had to apply within 1 year. And that is often a very common kind of mistake in the law that we see. She will have to show that there has been some sort of extraordinary circumstance, medical or mental health issues that have prevented her from applying within that first year. Or she could show that there have been changed circumstances. So maybe she entered the United States 10 years ago when everything was fine and calm in her home country, but now there's been a coup and the situation for women has become much more dangerous. And so she now finds herself in a situation where she's afraid to go home. And so she may apply for asylum past that first year of her entry here in the United States. Some other things to keep in mind is that if anyone has passed through Canada, there may be a prohibition on them applying for asylum here in the United States based on our Safe Third Country Agreement. There also is an issue if somebody has been offered what is called permanent residency, or an easier way to think about that is the equivalent of having green card status in another country. So in other words, they've really kind of firmly settled in another place where they found safety before coming to the United States. We also don't allow those that persecute others to claim asylum in the U.S. And then if there's been a conviction for a particularly serious crime outside of the United States, or an individual is involved in terrorist acts, that may prohibit them from qualifying for asylum in the U.S.
Okay, before we go to this question, Morgan, I want to go back to a question from the audience. And
sure.
This is a question that Kimberly Mason was asking, and it was, does membership include attempted for a sexual assault survivor who do not have a relationship with their persecutor or faces retribution? Or can membership include any previous successful cases?
So the membership in a particular social group category is meant to identify certain characteristics that group members might all share. It's hard to tell in this exact question what those characteristics might be, but for example, in cases where someone has been recruited into sex trafficking and has been forced to engage in commercial sex acts repeatedly, that could form a basis of a particular social group for a future fear claim, in the sense that an individual who's already been vulnerable to sex trafficking may be viewed by a persecutor as someone who is more vulnerable for future different types of harms. And therefore, you could create a particular social group around that type of harm in the past. We need to know more about the factual situation of that particular individual and what characteristics she might share with others who had also been targeted by the persecutor for sexual assault, before we could really craft the social group based on those characteristics. But that's what you'd be looking at. What do they share in common? What are the things that might have made this persecutor single her out?
Right, and then Kimberly had followed up with she'd been trying to find cases of members in particular social group defined as women surviving sexual assault, or those who are facing retribution as a result of sexual assault.
I'm not aware of any published case law on that, but this is one of those areas of the law where we just keep pushing the parameters of it. And so if there is a logical, viable argument that you can make, then you certainly want to make that. And often what we're doing is just looking at cases that are somewhat similar. So I mentioned the concept of those who have formerly been sex trafficked. There is a case in the Seventh Circuit, CC, that is holding to take a look at to try and kind of liken your situation to that.
Right, and Rocio has pointed out that if you need more specific technical assistance around a particular case, to contact NEWAP at info@newapp.org, and they'll be able to do more on the specifics. So thank you, Morgan. Now let's go to a question where we have people raise their hand. And I saw some people raise their hand already, so I don't know if this was for this question. Are you already screening for immigrant remedies such as VAWA, self-petition, or U-Visa? So go ahead and raise your hand. And I suspect we are going to see a large number in our audience here. please raise your hand if you are already screening for immigrant remedies such as VAWA self-petition or U-Visa. And indeed, we see 69, 70 members of our audience, about a third of our audience are doing this. So I'm now going to hand the podium over to Edna, as you're going to be talking about, Edna, some of the gender-based, how gender-based asylum differs from other immigrant remedies.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you, Morgan. That was actually a really great explanation of asylum relief in general. So if you all are already screening, or it sounds like a number of you are already screening for VAWA U and T visa cases, what we would suggest is that you also screen for gender-based asylum cases. And that's just to make sure that people are understanding all of the options that they may have under immigration law. But we also want to talk a little bit about some of the risks of filing for asylum versus a VAWA, a U, or a T visa case, and the differences. So Morgan had discussed a little bit of this in the beginning, so I won't go too much in depth with it. But U visas are visas for crime victims who have been victims of crime in the United States, where they have been helpful in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of that crime. So there is a component where they have to cooperate with law enforcement. T visas are also visas for victims of trafficking who are here in the United States on account of the trafficking that they suffered. There is also a component where they have to comply with any reasonable law enforcement requests unless they can prove that the trauma from the trafficking prevents them from doing so, or if they are a minor. And then VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, is for individuals who are a spouse, child, a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident parent, or the adult U.S. citizen son or daughter. And so that form of relief also occurs when someone suffers battery or string cruelty here in the United States and is connected to their family status to a U.S. citizen who is either their parent, their spouse, or adult son or daughter. Asylum, on the other hand, is when harm has occurred outside of the United States and is based on the U.S. obligations under international human rights law, as Morgan explained. So there are some differences, and you might have someone who comes into your office maybe not even seeking services for themselves, but maybe for their child or for a partner, and they disclose some information about themselves or ask for help because they are a survivor of sexual assault or domestic violence that occurred here in the United States, and they might not be eligible for VAWA, U, or T visa relief, but may be eligible for asylum. So keeping that in mind and asking some of those screening questions might be helpful in general. While it is helpful to screen for those things, asylum might not always, however, be the best form of relief. And if you are not an attorney, or if you really haven't done asylum cases before, one of the things that we would suggest is first getting technical assistance from NUAP, or also getting assistance from an attorney in the area who might practice immigration law and specifically asylum law, who can weigh all of the differences within the different forms of relief so that you're not placing anyone in any undue risk of being removed from the United States or applying for something that might not really be helpful to them in the end. And one of the reasons that I say this is this idea of membership in a particular social group. So Morgan went through the elements for asylum, and one of the things that is key to an asylum case is this idea of nexus. It's not just have you experienced harm or persecution in your home country. It has to be something that is subjective. The harm has to be subjective, and it has to be based in one of the five forms, or one of the five nexuses. So your political opinion, your religion, or your membership in a particular social group. And membership in a particular social group is not defined by statute under immigration law. So there's not some law you can point to that says this is what a particular social group is, or membership in a particular social group is. I mean, it's defined by case law, and what it essentially says is some characteristic that a person can't change about themselves. But that is really very subjective based on who is reviewing the case, based on how you formulate that membership in a particular social group and your understanding of asylum law and where you are. Morgan practices in the Fourth Circuit. Some of the things that she was discussing in terms of retaliation and extortion by gangs are not really viable cases in the Fifth Circuit where I practice. So we screen those cases very closely, and when we can make a distinction from Fifth Circuit law to make sure that people have a more viable asylum case, we'll do that. But if you don't have that understanding, it might make it more difficult for an individual. The Seventh Circuit case about former victims of sex trafficking or commercial prostitution, those types of cases are also not recognized in the Fifth Circuit. And so those are the things that you have to have an understanding about in order to move forward. If the ARCG case is a BIA case that's recognized in all of the circuits, so there might be something that overlaps that will allow someone to qualify for asylum and show their membership in a particular social group and that nexus very clearly, but you have to have that understanding. And the asylum process can be kind of risky for individuals. And one of the things that I always point to when I talk about this is the statistics from the Houston Asylum Office where I practice. So in January of 2015, they closed 209 cases. And of those 209 cases, only 68 of those were approved. That is a very, very low approval grant rate. And so it's one of the things that advocates and attorneys who go forward on these cases need to understand, because there might be a better form of relief for an individual if they're applying for VAWA, if they're applying for a U visa, or if they are a victim of trafficking and they're here in the United States on account of that trafficking and they can apply for a T visa. And so it's doing that type of analysis to see, one, let's screen for everything that this person might be eligible for, but also, two, what is the best form of relief. So the asylum process in general, I will go through in terms of explaining that there are two ways to apply for asylum. One is affirmatively, and the other is defensively. And affirmatively means you apply for asylum with USCIS, so through your local asylum office. So here in the Texas area, it would be the Houston Asylum Office. I believe in the East Coast you can apply through the Baltimore Asylum Office. So there are specific asylum offices where you can submit your application for asylum with all of your supporting documents to show why you qualified. If you're applying defensively, that means that you are already in deportation proceedings. You have been picked up at the border and placed in deportation proceedings, you are detained and in deportation proceedings, or your affirmative case has been referred. So it's been denied by USCIS or referred, and they've referred you to the immigration judge, so you can apply again before the immigration judge, but you must do so in deportation proceedings. And I point that out because that is one of the risks that is involved with these types of cases. You might have someone who has had no contact with immigration, is not in deportation proceedings, and you apply for asylum affirmatively, but they may be referred and then placed into deportation proceedings, which places them at greater risk in the end. Morgan talked a little bit about the one-year filing deadline, so I won't get into anything with that. The only other thing I would say is if you have someone who is filing outside of that one-year deadline, the standard for protection under withholding of removal or the Convention Against Torture, which is you apply together with asylum for, is much higher than just regular asylum. So it's something to keep in mind and something where we really do encourage you to work with an immigration attorney to discuss. Also, if you file a frivolous claim, you can be barred from any other forms of relief. And so what we always make clear is that a frivolous claim is not one that is denied, but one instead where most of the facts are made up or there are significant lies within the application that would make it frivolous. So just having an understanding of that with your clients is always very important. So we always recommend that asylum should not be filed without speaking with an attorney first to kind of gauge all of the different forms of other relief that might be available and the risks involved with filing for asylum. And in doing that, a lot of you are advocates, so we want to ensure that advocates have a role within this process, because advocates do have a role within this process and are really key in explaining parts of the asylum process to clients, and also in actively assisting within the process while individuals are going through it. So what we generally have advocates work with clients on when they are working with us on asylum cases are identifying factors in a survivor's experience. And that might be through helping them craft a statement that gets attached to their asylum application. They can also be really critical in gathering supporting documentation, either from the home country or documentation of services that are provided here. Like Morgan mentioned before, one of the elements for asylum is showing that the person has suffered persecution, and that that they have a subjective fear of returning home as well too. And so they can document that subjective fear through documentation of services that they have received here because of the trauma that they have suffered in their home country, by helping them craft their story, and also connecting survivors to resources, which can be further documentation that they're receiving these resources and services because of the harm that they have been subjected to in their home country.
And now this is Leslie, if I may. I just wanted to add that one of the things that we've seen over the years is that advocates in particular have developed the kind of relationship over time with clients that will help them, because they're doing work about counseling and therapy and support and trauma-informed services. It's those kinds of services that help women come forward more quickly to reveal the kinds of trauma they've suffered, and can play a huge role in helping identify these cases early so that people don't run up or miss that one-year deadline, and that it's a really important role because they won't even get to the lawyers if the advocates don't find the cases oftentimes. The other thing I wanted to say, and Edna, maybe you can weigh in on this as well, is that for lawyers who are not immigration lawyers, some of you may not have the immigration resources in your communities who can just take the asylum case while you do the family law case, for example. And so one of the things that's available to you is that if there's not somebody in your state, or we can help connect you to somebody who may be in your state who could provide you expertise and support you in deciding whether it's viable to go forward in a gender-based asylum case, for example, for your client. But also through NewApp, we provide that TA through Edna and through Tahiri and other places we can connect you with to get those that case evaluation to decide whether it is a gender-based asylum case and to support you through the process of the application.
Okay.
Anything else, Edna, on that point?
No, I think you covered it really well, Leslie, and I think that advocates do play a really important role because of their close relationship with the clients. And a lot of times, if we don't encounter someone who just comes into our office seeking services in general, most of our referrals for our survivors do come from advocates. So I think that they are really important in moving forward in any type of case.
And for the people that are on the phone that are from law enforcement or the courts or other kinds of first responders, those of you working in mental health and counseling and in hospitals, it's really important because you can also play that same identifying role like you might do in human trafficking cases, for example, or domestic violence and sexual assault cases otherwise, of being the first person, because you've been here to this webinar and now you know what you're looking for, to identify a case, to screen it so that victims have the opportunity to assess whether this is, for them, maybe the only immigration option they have, and that they get to someone to file the case in a timely manner.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to pass the podium to Bibi, who is going to begin to address access to LSC-funded legal services.
Great. Thank you, David. So, and thank you, Morgan and Edna. That was a really great overview and great discussion of the different elements. So I'm going to take a step back, actually, and I'm going to sort of go through the two legal services options that that victims might have who are maybe looking to pursue gender-based asylum in terms of accessing legal services. So I'm going to start with LSC-funded legal services. And in order to explain the new regulations that came out, I'm going to start by sort of talking about what happened prior to the issuance of those regulations. So VAWA 2005 provided expanded access to legal services to victims of crime, immigrant victims of crime. And prior to the issuance of the regulations that implemented that expansion, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether LSC funded. And LSC, just for those of you who are new to this, is the Legal Services Corporation. And so prior to these regulations, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether LSC-funded programs could represent immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other crimes, because the regulations that were in place prior to 2014, when the new regulations came out, did not permit representation. They were not in line with the expansion of VAWA 2005.
Guys need to communicate. Silence everyone again, and then put BB back on.
Let's do that. So we shall do the. I will mute all lines.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
I apologize for that. BB, can you press *6 to unmute?
Hi, yep, this is BB. Can everybody hear me?
You are crystal clear.
Okay, I don't know where I was cut off, but I just want to, again, reiterate that there was a lot of confusion prior to 2014 because the regulations were not in line with the statute. And, representation was allowed under VAWA 2005 and LSC generally, it's just that the regulations had not captured that. Next slide, please. So what was the result of this confusion? 20.6% of immigrant crime survivors were turned away from LSC-funded programs based on their lack of legal immigration status, which was not something they were required to show in order to access legal services as immigrant crime victims. And 26.1% of immigrant survivors were turned away because the LSC-funded program wasn't certain whether they could represent them, again, because they were referring back to regulations that were inconsistent with the statute. So that sort of creates that gives you the context of why these regulations were sorely needed and how they can potentially be helpful to clients that you may come across, particularly advocates if you're looking for legal representation for your clients. This is really, really critical to understand. Next slide. So the 2014 regulation, again, like I said, implements expansions in both the Violence Against Women Act of 2000 and 2005. They were issued in April 2014, and they protect immigrant survivors who need access to legal services. It created two paths. VAWA 2005 and the regulations together have created these two paths that an immigrant can use to receive assistance from any LSC-funded program. These two paths are representation under the anti-abuse statute, or the representation is based on immigration status of the person who walks into an LSC-funded agency. So what do I mean by anti-abuse laws? So next slide, please. This means that LSC-funded programs can represent the following immigrant survivors without regard to that person's immigration status. So long as the person falls into one of these categories of victimization, they are eligible. It's battered or they're either battered or subjected to extreme cruelty. They're a victim of sexual assault or trafficking, victim of severe forms of trafficking in person, or a victim of a U-visa criminal activity. So the long list of U-visa criminal activities, anyone who has been a victim of any of those criminal activities is eligible. And representation is available whether or not the survivor has plans to file for any sort of immigration relief or VAWA-related immigration relief. So filing for something is not required, and so that's that's something that comes up when I believe it was Morgan who had brought it up, that there are other things other forms of immigration to consider when you're working with a client, and so even though that consideration takes place when an attorney is working with one of these survivors, it doesn't mean that they are required to file for any immigration relief to obtain access to these legal services. So next slide. So understanding the difference between the two paths. What does this mean in terms of someone who is in need of legal services? The next two slides are sort of going to give you an overview, and this is for your future reference of who's eligible under each path, right? So as we reviewed, under the anti-abuse statutes, it's survivors of these particular crimes or harms or violence that are eligible under the anti-abuse statute. And again, this is where their immigration status does not matter. But on the next slide, if you see the eligibility that's based on immigration status, these are the particular categories who, based on their immigration status, are going to have access to a broader range of legal services. So what does that mean? When someone is eligible under the anti-abuse statute, the legal services that they are requiring have to do with their abuse. And I'm going to go over that in a second. But it's a very specific type of legal service that they need. So anything, it could be filing for immigration related, for immigration relief. It could be filing for whether that's gender-based asylum, whether that is U visas, anything of that sort. But it can also include custody. They may need help in custody proceedings. They may need help in a divorce proceeding. So long as they can tie that need to their abuse, then they are eligible to receive that legal service. However, if they are eligible based on their immigration status, they can seek legal services for anything. There is no restriction upon the legal services that they can receive. So why is that important? Something to consider when you're working, especially with clients where you're considering filing for gender-based asylum or asylum generally, is to make this distinction. Next slide, please. So once asylum is granted, that immigrant is eligible to receive legal assistance based on the immigration-based track. So that means they can access legal services for anything that they may need. It doesn't need to be tied to the violence that they had suffered. Once the asylum is granted, they are now able to access legal services for anything. However, undocumented immigrants who are applying for or have pending applications for asylum generally don't have access to LSD-funded legal services. So unless there is that underlying violence that is tied to those categories I talked about earlier, they wouldn't qualify under anti-abuse, and because they don't have immigration status yet, they wouldn't qualify for immigration status-based access to legal services either. So that's something to just keep in mind, something to think about as you're working with clients who may fall into this category. And you may hear that asylum is not eligible, and this is why. Generally, asylum, people who are applying for or have pending applications for asylum don't have access. So,
Bibi,
next slide. Yes.
I just want to weigh in. This is, as you said, the crux of where a lot of the confusion come. And so for people who are LSC funded, another way to look at it is this is the one area where you could do asylum law because it is for a victim.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, and so like I said, the legal services that are provided under the anti-abuse statute have to be related to the underlying abuse. And what does that mean? The legal service that a person requires is needed to escape from the abusive situation, ameliorate the current effects of the abuse, or protect against future abuse, so long as the recipient can show the necessary connection to the representations of the abuse. So again, like I said, that covers a pretty wide gambit of services that someone may need, including applying for gender-based asylum. So if you are seeking out LSC-funded legal services for your client, remember that this is something that will need to be shown at the intake process to show that they are eligible. Next slide, please. So this I just wanted to provide kind of a visual of how the cycle works, where, or how the two paths work, rather. Again, immigration status eligibility, unrestricted access to a wide range of services, and then anti-abuse eligibility, it's limited to the abuse. And this way, it's just an easy way to remember when you're looking at LSC-funded agencies, whether they can help your client or not.
Bibi, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Someone had posed the question of whether you can use this argument for SIJ applications. This is on the previous slide.
This is Leslie. I can take that question. So what happens is that there's actually a policy program letter, I can't remember, I think it's 14-3. We can post a link to it.
Yes,
that states that they can represent children who are eligible for SIJS. The issue is the children have to have been victims of battering or extreme cruelty, essentially domestic violence or child abuse, if it's abandonment or neglect, you'd have to show that it raised to the level of battering or extreme cruelty to fit within the legal services representation definition.
Yep, and that's correct. It is program letter 14-3.
Program letter 14-3, right, just to clarify that. Great.
Yes, and we will be posting that.
And Rocio just posted that. Great. Back to you, Bibi.
Thank you so much. So, and just to clarify again, because you're dealing with clients who suffered this abuse in their home country, what does that mean in terms of representation and where the abuse occurred? With regard to where the victimization occurred, whether it's inside or outside of the U.S., where part of the abuse occurred within the U.S. or violated U.S. law, representation is allowed. That is both in the statute and in the regulation. And this is a point, I'm clarifying this because there was confusion when the regulation came out about what this meant. So this is a clarification that we like to make when we talk about representation and where the abuse occurred. And then for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault that occurred abroad and violated U.S. law, representation is allowed. Again, through the program letter, this was clarified. So that program letter is really helpful, and it needs to be read in conjunction with the regulation that opened up this access, this eligibility under the anti-abuse statute. So that's something we want to put on your radar. Again, Rocio just posted that, and we'll also have that as part of the materials that go with this webinar. So we'll have the program letter and the regulations up so that way you can see them together and see what the breadth of representation is. So now I'm going to move on to access to LAV-funded legal services. So that LAV stands for Legal Assistance for Victims, and there are the programs that are funded by this. I want to go over the restrictions to their representation. So you can kind of compare and see whether LSC-funded organizations might be a better fit for your client or LAV might work. There are age requirements, and representation is limited to direct victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and or stalking. This can include human trafficking survivors. However, trafficking cannot be the primary victimization. The survivor can qualify if they're a victim of one of the above crimes, and then there's a trafficking element involved as well. Leslie, I believe the age requirement is that they must be over the age of 14? 11. Okay, so it's over the age of 11. So again, LSC does not have age restrictions, whereas LAV does. So that's something to consider, especially SIJS came up as a question just now. That's something to think about when you're considering which legal services agency you want to approach to assist your client. And then something that, next slide please. So if you do go to an LAV agency, something where they do differ in a way that might expand access to some of your clients is the location of the abuse is not relevant. So that whole equation that we talked about doesn't even exist in this context. And there's no restriction on asylum case representation. So where your client may not be eligible under LSC, something to remember is that they may be eligible for LAV-funded representation. Leslie, is there anything else you wanted to add on the LAV representation versus LSC?
I saw an LSC question in the text that I was actually just trying to type to that I wanted to respond to. That somebody mentioned that their program accepts Kennedy Amendment cases. The Kennedy Amendment from '97 is a much narrower group of cases than the representation under the new legal services regulations anti-abuse path allows. So the anti-abuse path allows essentially representation of anybody who's battered or subject to extreme cruelty, a victim of sexual assault, a victim of human trafficking, or a victim of any other U visa criminal activity. The Kennedy Amendment was really limited to certain kinds of cases of battering extreme cruelty. And so what we're talking about here in the kinds of victims that can be represented by LSC-funded programs in these gender-based asylum cases and other types of cases is much, much broader than it used to be 2 years ago, let's say. So I just wanted to make that point.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we are now.
So how many of you, I guess the other question would be, how many of you are working on in LSC-funded programs that are accepting cases under the anti-abuse path for immigrant victims right now? Can you raise your hands?
Can you repeat the question so people can hear that?
Yes, so the question is how many of you are working for LSC-funded organizations that are accepting cases of immigrant survivors under the anti-abuse path of representation? I have a few.
Looks like it's just about 11 of us here.
And how many of you are working in, can you take the hands down, David? How many of you are working in communities where victims who are victims of, as I said, domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, wherever it occurred, inside or outside of the United States, or any U visa crime, that are still being turned away from LSC-funded programs?
Okay, so how many are still being turned away? And we're seeing we have a similar number.
Well, the good news is that's a smaller number than I had expected to see, which is great news. It means a lot more programs are learning about what representation they can do. So that's really good. And if that's happening, please call us for TA. We can provide you, BB takes calls all the time on this, and we can provide you information so that if you've got a gender-based asylum client or a client that's eligible for VAWA or U or other family law remedies, public benefits, they need other kinds of help related to overcoming the abuse, that they can get representation, and that we can make sure that the programs that are receiving LSC and LAV funding are representing the broad range of people that they're able to receive under those funding streams.
Okay. We have another question in the audience. Can you make the argument that securing housing, securing public benefits, et cetera, is related to the abuse because it's helping the victim become independent from the abuser?
Absolutely you can. This is Leslie again. You absolutely can. And in fact, I think, I'll see if I can find it quickly during this webinar, but if you call us for TA, we actually have a memo that we wrote at one point to HUD where we came up with all of the list of reasons how housing is connected. And so we can make, generally speaking, anything, the definition in the legal services regulations for the kinds of help related to the abuse is very good and very broad. It's one of the best in law. And it really says that anything that's connected that she needs as a result of the abuse, to protect herself from abuse, to overcome the effects of the abuse, to move on and rebuild her life after the abuse, all of those things qualify, and housing is clearly one of them. And so is benefits access in terms of her being able to survive and move on and get away from her perpetrator and stop his influence in her life.
Great. Well, thank you. We do want to highlight several gender-based asylum resources that you can see. So ASISTA, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, and Immigration Advocates Network, also additional resources from the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service Guide for Asylum Seekers and the UCCIS on Asylum are resources that you'll get that you can be able to. And, of course, you can always be able to contact. Right now, the slides will be available soon on the New App Go site, and we'll also be able to get our New Apps webinar, and you always can contact New App for technical assistance by calling the number 202-274-4457. That's 202-274-4457, or always send email.
And Rocio, can you post the Go link at which it will be? It won't be Legal Services. It'll probably be another name. I'm not exactly sure.
Those will be coming soon. We're still working, I know, a little bit on that. Thank you. Okay. So are there any questions? This is the time to be able to ask questions. We do have a few minutes remaining of today's session, and so I want to be able to see if there are any other questions that people have.
Maybe while we're waiting for people to type in, I would like to address this as Leslie to Edna and Morgan. If you could just summarize again how you think, what do you think the predominant kind of cases that victims are going to see coming in, that advocates are going to see or attorneys are going to see coming in their door that are going to be the most common forms of gender-based asylum that are actually legitimate, viable gender-based asylum cases for immigrant survivors?
Who wants to take that first, Bibi or Morgan?
Edna.
Edna. Hi, Edna.
Hi, David. So this is Edna. So what we see here a lot, I mean, I think it depends on the people who are coming to get services, but I will say the vast majority of asylum cases that we see are ones based in domestic violence, the ARCG cases. They may be a little bit different in terms of their specific fact patterns. We also do see a lot of extortion and gang cases and a lot of the narco extortion cases, just because we're here in Texas. And some of those can be viable. It depends on the specific circumstances of them. So we screen pretty carefully for those in terms of those cases. So Morgan, what are you seeing when out in Baltimore and Virginia in that area?
Morgan, you might have to hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Awesome. Can you hear me now? This is Morgan. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So similar to what Edna's seeing out in Houston, we're also seeing a lot of those gang-based claims and the domestic violence claims, which are often our most successful cases. I will add that we also have a significant African population in this area in diaspora. So we would add to that the cases that have to do with female genital mutilation or cutting and refusal to undergo that procedure or having undergone it in the past, or as a parent trying to protect children from undergoing that type of harm, which can be successful cases in our area. And we also we've seen an increase or an uptick in cases of individuals who are fleeing forced marriages and don't want to marry under the circumstances that they're facing. So those would be the two other types of cases that I would add on to the more gang-based and typical DV cases that we're seeing.
So we have 3 questions from participants. I'm going to try to shoot them off to you really quickly. If they have a case in which 2 children whose grandfather physically abused them, what evidence would you want to see for a gender-based asylum case there? If there is one, or might there be, how might there be?
Leslie, that's actually a great reminder. I think the other type of case that I failed to mention was that we've been very successful in the child abuse cases. So claims where children are targeted by family members and abused because of their family relationship. So that would be family as a social group. And the type of evidence that you would need to submit is, anything that really kind of linked the harm to the fact that the perpetrator carrying out that harm felt a right to abuse the child because of that relationship status within the family.
So another question would be, somebody asked if the abuse happened outside of the country, would they have to have reported it to local authorities before coming to the United States to seek asylum?
So this is Edna. There's no requirement that you have to actually report to the police for an asylum case, but like Morgan said, one of the elements of asylum is showing that your government is unable or unwilling to protect you. So you would have to show through maybe country conditions that even if you didn't report, there was a reason why you didn't report, because police don't get involved in certain types of cases, or because there was a connection with the police and the abuse, something like that. There's no actual requirement to report to the police, but you do have to show the government is unwilling or unable to protect you.
Great. We are only at last minute. Any other questions? I'm looking at, it appears that we have gotten the questions that people have been putting in there. So
maybe in conclusion, this is Leslie. I will thank you all for joining us and say, please don't hesitate to contact NUAP Inc. and we will, NUAP NAU for technical assistance if you have questions and you're working on a case. We encourage the lawyers to think about doing this and to find resources in your community. If you'd like to do a case even before the case comes to you, call us and we can connect you with technical assistance resources and help you find somebody in your community that can be assistant, help you or connect you with Morgan or Edna's organization or others who can provide technical assistance so you can do the cases. And to the advocates that are on the call and the people from courts and law enforcement, we thank you too for joining and understanding the important role that all of you can play in helping make sure that we can identify these cases when women come to your communities as soon as possible so that they have an opportunity, if they qualify, to apply for gender-based asylum. Thank you very, very much for joining us today, and please don't hesitate to contact us. And the information will be online, and I guess David will send out an email together to all of you who have attended with the resources to help you move forward on screening and handling these cases. Thank you very, very much. Have a great day.
In about a half hour, you'll receive an email with the information, including an evaluation of today's session. Thank you for joining us for today's NUAP web conference. We look forward to seeing you in future NUAP web conferences. So this concludes today's session.
Okay.